my name is Chris Pitts, and I'm the president of the Waban Area Council. This debate is brought to you by the 4 area councils of Waban, Upper Falls, the Highlands, and Newtonville. And the area councils are comprised of unpaid elected representatives. Putting on these debates takes considerable effort, and I'd like to acknowledge all the members of the councils and the working groups for putting in quality time. Let's talk about the debates. So these are for the at-large city council seats in Ward 1 and 2. Please know that all of us can vote for one candidate to these races. Any questions that are not used on air will be forwarded to the campaign so they can respond. We did get quite a few questions this time in the 8 so years we've been putting on debates. And for this debate, the debate worked combined questions on like topics. The final list of questions has not been shared with anyone outside the debate working group and the moderator. So we did receive a lot of questions regarding the school. Now, the city council votes on the budget of the schools and can write letters in favor or opposed to things that the new schools does. But the school committee is the government body that makes the decisions on hiring, curriculum, scheduling. In short, they're the ones who hold jurisdiction over the schools and not the city council. Now, I want to set everyone at ease here because we are in great hands. Our moderator is very experienced, and anyone who's been in a debate with Marjorie can tell you she's all pro, respectful, and knows Newton. In fact, she's moderated almost all of our 4 council debates, and I believe that means everybody, including our current mayor, everybody on the city council, and everybody on the school committee has been at the table with Marjorie. She was a print and broadcast reporter and a national leader in opinion writing. She writes a widely read blog, MarjorieArons-Barron.com. She was editorial director at WCVB TV, Channel 5 in Boston for 20 years and produced many of the station's political candidate forums. Among her many awards are 3 Emmys and 5 times the National Award for Excellence in Television Editorials from the National Broadcast Editorial Association. And in 2019, she was inducted into the Massachusetts Broadcasters Hall of Fame. So while we have guidelines for our debate process, we do give Marjorie a lot of latitude to make her own decisions and make just adjustments as she sees fit. The point is, we want to find out who these candidates are, what they really think, how prepared they are for the job, ultimately who we want to vote for. So let me do really briefly the guidelines of the debate. Answers in general should be under 45 seconds, but Marjorie may extend. Rebuttals will be limited to 30 seconds, but again, she may extend or add additional time. All candidates and our moderator will see a 15-second warning before their time allotment and then a stop. Again, she may ask her own questions and probe into answers as she sees fit. Candidates will be given an opportunity to ask a question of one of the other candidates at the end of their debate. Closing statements are 30 to 45 seconds. We've asked the candidates to make their virtual backgrounds as neutral as possible by removing campaign or social statement paraphernalia. And this is to emulate what we do when we do these live. Okay, so it's very neutral now. We've asked all the candidates not to use any notes or receive information and coaching during the debates. And Ward 1 is expected to be about 1 hour, and Ward 2 is be about 90 minutes, actually a little bit less since we trimmed it down to 15 as our end time. So we're predetermining the order of the ward debates to meet a scheduling request from a candidate that involves a vaccination appointment, and all the participants agreed. So we'll be starting with Ward 2. Without further ado, let's get started.
Great, thanks, Chris. Obviously, we're all here because there are 2 open positions on the Newton City Council, both of them citywide positions, as you have heard, which means that all Newton voters may participate in the March 16th special election. The Ward 1 seat was vacated by the unexpected death of City Councilor Jay Ciccone, and the Ward 2 seat was vacated by Jake Auchincloss, who, as you know, was recently sworn in as our 4th District Congressman. To accommodate the position, as Chris has said, we're going to start with Ward 2 and go on to Ward 1. I will start each race by sharing with you thumbnail sketches of the candidates. Now, these cameo introductions have been provided by the candidates themselves. So let's begin. The three candidates for Ward 2 Councilor-at-Large. Brian Barish says he is deeply committed to public service and has the experience to use the tools of government to make a positive impact for Newton. He has served for the past 6 years as general counsel for Senator Harriet Chandler. A graduate of Boston College Law School, Brian serves on the Newton Human Rights Commission and on the boards of the Jewish Alliance for Law and Social Action, the JCRC, and the New Art Center. Tariq Lucas has been living in Newtonville since 2009. He's a former elected member and vice president of the Newtonville Area Council and currently serves on the Newtonville Historic District Commission. During the day, he works for Harvard University Press as a royalty specialist and is a member of the Harvard Union of Clerical and Technical Workers. Tariq also works part-time as a youth and adult soccer and basketball referee. And finally, David Mickley was born and raised in Newton, and he and his wife Molly, also a Newton native, are the proud parents of 2 girls, Lily, 2 years old, and Zoe, 4 months old. David has a BA from Emory, an MBA from MIT, and experience in the nonprofit, public, and private sectors. He supports strengthening Newton public schools and a diversified housing supply that enables people from multiple generations and across life stages to call Newton home. So let's start with a series of questions that, as you heard in the introduction, do start with time limits for first response and possible rebuttal, but we'll follow up more informally in conversation mode. So the very first question goes to all three. Could you explain specifically how your professional accomplishments, community service, and other life experiences over the last decade, and particularly your experience with Newton City government, have equipped you to be an effective member of the City Council and representative of the people? Let's start with Brian.
Great. Thank you so much, Marjorie, for hosting us, and to the area councils for having us, and for everyone for watching today. So I have served for the past 6 years as general counsel for State Senator Harriet Chandler up in the legislature. I help her write her legislation and develop her policies. I've had to be a generalist, so I'm used to working on a diverse set of policies where, every day I deal with new issues I've never even heard of before, as well as ones that I've been deeply committed to. I've been able to co-author legislation like the Roe Act, which protects reproductive rights and passed this past month, as well as major environmental and civics education legislation. Locally, I'm on the Human Rights Commission, working on issues around diversity and equity, racial justice, pushing back against anti-Semitism. So many of the issues that are important to our city today are issues I've been working on either in my state or my local capacity.
Okay, Tariq, could you again try to make the specific link between what you have been doing and what you would be doing on the City Council?
Yes, thank you for the question. As a former elected member of the Newtonville Area Council and Vice President, I led on the creation of the Area Council's Envisioning Washington Street survey. And to help encourage residential participation in our survey, we mailed out 11,000 postcards to the residents that live near Washington Street. So I'm someone who's going to reach out and actively listen to residents and find out what they want for the city that they love very much. I also serve on the Newtonville Historic District Commission. We preserve historical architecture while letting homeowners modernize by adding some density and energy efficiency. In 2017, I worked on the No One Charter campaign, which helped preserve local representation in Newton.
And finally, David, speak a little bit, if you will, about the specific links between what you have been doing and how that would translate in your activities on the City Council.
Yeah, thanks, Margie. So I think a few things. First, my personal life experience. Having grown up here, having parents that still live here, and having kids here, I have the personal perspective of 3 generations of my family that live here right now. And what I would be doing on the City Council is advocating for Newton continue to be a place for people at all those different life stages to make their home. On the professional experience side, I think there's 2 things. One is I have experience in investment management, and I think Newton is going to face some huge financial challenges in the years ahead. My experience working in that space will help do that kind of work. And the other thing is I have experience working at a technology startup. I think there's a huge opportunity for Newton to welcome more technology and life science companies. I have the professional perspective to know what would attract those companies to come to Newton.
All right, does anyone want to add any or rebut anything that's been said, or we probably should move on to, specific policy areas, unless there's some reason not to. For example, if you could change just one single city policy, what would that be and why? And for that, let's just start with Tariq.
Thank you. The one city policy I would like to see actively changed here in Newton is our inclusionary zoning ordinance. I would like to see more affordable housing options for people and families in Newton. I would like to see that number go up from 15% up to 25%. That is something that I will actively pursue as a member of the city council. And I would also advocate for it during special permit processes for large developments here in Newton.
Okay, David, what is your thinking? If you only could change one thing in the city, what would it be?
Yeah, I think one thing that would go a long way to making Newton more accessible for young families and for elderly folks that want to downsize is having multifamilies in strategic locations throughout the city. That means near transit centers, near village centers, not all over the city, in certain parts of the city. I think that would make a big difference.
Brian, your one policy objective. It's hard to pick one.
Yeah, so it is hard to pick one, but I'm going to tell you the first thing that I would advocate for, the first ordinance I would write would be to require that every public body has a public comment policy, because I have seen far too many people come to a public meeting and having to sit through it for hours before they get a chance to say their piece. And I want our city council and our city boards and commissions to work for the people who elect us, not for it to be about our convenience, but to be about your convenience.
I've heard different debates, and the whole issue of transparency in governance comes up from time to time. How would you achieve greater transparency, which I think would address what you're talking about, Brian?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, Brian, and then Tariq and David.
Wait, is Brian, who's?
Brian, because he had...
Sorry about that. Sure. So absolutely, I think that transparency is incredibly important. It's something that I'm prioritizing in my campaign. Public comments are part of it, and it's about getting city council out of City Hall and into the neighborhoods. We need to be having conversations in public places, open office hours, where people can come in to discuss topics like zoning reform, similar to what we did with the Washington Street Vision process. I believe we need to have our public votes available online in an easy to understand format for city council. There's so many pieces like this that we could do to both make it more transparent, but also to modernize the way that our city government operates and make it more interactive.
All right, let me move on to Tariq, because in other debates, I have heard you talk about transparency in a couple of contexts. How would you achieve that?
Yes, one thing we have learned from the pandemic is that attendance at city council committee meetings, which is where most of the work is done on the city council, it's done in committee work, but we have seen the attendance through Zoom at city council committee meetings go up compared to the years prior. So we need to continue that. So I would like to see video and audio recording devices in those small conference rooms at City Hall once the pandemic is over.
Okay, David, they just waved a wrap-up sign, Tariq, for you. So David, do you have anything that you would like to add on the issue of transparency?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of those things. I think two other things. One is a tech-enabled dashboard that collects all the votes and makes it very easy to see who voted on what. And the second is I think we need to translate more of our city work into other languages so people that don't have English as a first language can understand what we're working on.
Okay, we're going to move now through a series of topics. They're all kind of interwoven. We're going to start talking about commercial development and then move into density and zoning issues. So let's just begin with that. The pandemic has brought some profound changes in where we live, where we work, where we spend our time. Given the uncertainties and fluidity of the real estate market caused by COVID-19, what are your thoughts on whether Newton should proceed with or pause any further steps toward expanding housing in a way that the mayor and some members of the city council have proposed before COVID-19? Let's start with you, David, on that.
Yeah, sure. I think this is an incredible opportunity and we need to move swiftly to take advantage of it. People are moving out of the city into the suburbs and we want to make Newton an attractive option, both for people moving and for companies looking for new office space. So I think just take the COVID-19 work. There's 70 local companies right now working on COVID-19 diagnostics, therapeutics. They should make their home in Newton. They should run their businesses in Newton, but we need to act swiftly to attract those companies here.
Let's see, Brian.
Yeah, even as COVID-19 has had so many impacts on our community, one thing that hasn't stopped is housing prices going up and up and up. And Newton has continued to get further and further out of reach for far too many families. You know, for that teacher and social worker who used to be able to afford somewhere to buy in Newton, and they can't anymore. So I do believe we need to keep using all the tools in our toolbox to create housing affordability.
Tariq?
Yeah, as it relates to zoning redesign, we should target zoning redesign towards solving actual problems, not radical solutions that increase teardowns and bring more expensive housing. So I wouldn't put a halt to zoning redesign, but I would maybe rein it in a little bit and have it, more targeted to solve real problems for real issues. More affordable options to families and people of all incomes.
David, you said—
Marjorie, if I could.
David, who was just speaking?
That was
Brian I was going to rebut, but if you want to do David first, that's fine.
Okay, David, you said elsewhere that based on your experience in Brookline, that the right kind of, this is a direct quote, the right kind of economic development is central to generate affordable housing. What kind of economic development is the right kind for Newton?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a mix of a few things. Like what I was mentioning before is I think we can grow a life science and technology ecosystem. Startups and life science companies can make their homes in Newton. And I think that would do many things for the city in terms of supporting our small businesses, increasing our commercial tax base, and giving us the funding we need to invest in things like affordable housing. But if we don't have that tax base, we just won't have the funding for it. So I think it comes down to where's the revenue going to come from? And I think life science and technology companies is a great opportunity for us to get that revenue.
Okay, that's a wrap. Brian, did you have a rebuttal that you wanted to make briefly?
Yes, so I do. I don't understand the use of these words like radical by my opponent. I favor a targeted zoning approach where we are having very specific goals around more middle-income housing, around affordability, around stopping teardowns and McMansions. I've been very clear about that. So I don't understand why he keeps making this point that just isn't true.
Tariq?
Can I rebut?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Quickly, please.
Yes, just to respond to Mr. Barish ever so quickly. On social media and on many blog posts, you have been advocating for the elimination of single-family zoning, which would be a major game changer in Newton. So I believe the term radical, that may not, you may not like the term, but I certainly think it fits.
Okay, before we will get—
It's not true.
We will get back to zoning redesign, but before we leave the notion of commercial development, the Riverside development, just 3 months after plans were finalized, has asked for changes. They'd be eliminating the hotel and commercial space, including a grocery store, reducing the number of apartments and adding a life sciences center. So what's your assessment of this proposed change? And please also take into account the impact of on the decision of new state rules on how many votes are needed and also new percentages of affordable housing. And let's start for that with Tariq.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, as it relates to Riverside and the potential changes happening with the special permit. I'm going to do what I did as a Newtonville area councilor. I'm going to reach out to the residents of Newton, especially the residents of Lower Falls and Auburndale, and I'm going to find out what they want to see in the Riverside development. If they want to see a laboratory or a hotel, it ultimately should, I think, a lot of it should be up to them. I'm going to represent them in their viewpoints.
Okay, David?
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm not supposed to comment on a specific proposal that still hasn't been decided due to the quasi-judicial role of the city council. So I don't want to comment too specifically on that new proposal. It has to go through its process. But on the other
Don't
question,
you have some sort of intuitive response as a citizen of Newton?
yeah, I just am not sure if I'm supposed to be able to be public on that as a potential candidate for a quasi-judicial role. But I can give you my larger sentiment on what I think about. I mean, it's sort of, it's consistent with what I was saying before. My general sentiment is that growing out our commercial tax base in a thoughtful and strategic way is essential for Newton's.
Okay, that's a wrap. Brian, Brian?
Sure. Yeah, so, I think that there is an extent to which a deal's a deal, but we have to do what's best for Newton. So we have to look at the proposal. If we decide it's in the best interest of Newton to alter the proposal and allow that, I'm for it. But I do think the new percentages of affordable housing that we've increased need to be used for the updated proposal if we move forward with it and we're able to.
Okay, so whether we're talking about economic development or residential development, there is an issue of density, and the Riverside, Northland, and the Washington Street corridor are adding over 3,000 dwelling units to Newton and increasing our population by about 5,400 people. Starting with Tariq, how much of a population increase do you want Newton to have?
I think for a population increase, we should maybe go back to the 2007 comprehensive study for Newton. And what that particular study said, that Newton should probably add 10% more housing based upon its year 2000 housing totals, which comes to about maybe 3,100 housing units. So maybe it's time that we do another comprehensive plan and find out what the maximum population for Newton ought to be. But let's just go off of the 2007 report.
Brian, do you support residential development that further increases population density? And what do you think the ideal population of Newton is and why?
Yeah, I do support it. We've made a commitment as part of the Metro Mayors Coalition with over a dozen other Metro Boston towns to be part of the solution around having housing production, because housing production has been a critical issue that has caused housing prices to inflate. And so I do think we need to take it on a project by project basis and be thoughtful about making sure each project fits the village that it's in and makes sense and has the right transportation access, traffic, school population, et cetera. But that where it is good for Newton, we should be supporting more housing.
Well, David, could you weigh in on the same question? How much population growth do you think that Newton can and should absorb given its current infrastructure, streets and sidewalks, schools, water, and so you know what it is. And especially with the additional housing units that are already in the pipeline.
Yeah, I mean, Newton definitely can grow. In 1960, Newton's peak population was 92,000. We're still under that today at around 89,000. The Massachusetts population is growing at a faster rate than Newton. The Middlesex County population is growing at a faster rate than Newton. We've kept artificial caps on supply that make housing prices go up. And I think we can grow. We can grow in a thoughtful way. We can grow in a strategic way. And we can grow in a way that's going to help us also gain more tax revenue to fund all the things we want to do.
Brian, Tariq, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to clarify something that Mr. Barris said. Yes, Newton entered into that housing pact, not an accurate statement. Mayor Fuller went into that housing pact, and that's going to potentially lead to 11,000 more housing units. So that's why I say we need to go back to that 2007 comprehensive report and find out what the maximum population ought to be in Newton.
David, do you support or oppose the mayor's action with respect to that West Metro Mayor's Coalition, which in the aggregate talks about creating 185,000 new housing units by 2030?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea for the greater Boston community to come together to solve that as a community, because no one city can take that on our own. And it's going to be a very hard thing to address, but I think having at least an aspiration of working on growing the housing stock is a priority that I believe in.
There is a concern I've heard among some Newton residents that the dense development is being concentrated in a few neighborhoods of Newton, with other areas largely untouched. Let's start with Tariq. To what extent do you agree? And if so, how should it be addressed? And then we'll go on to David and Brian.
Yeah, we've seen development all around the city, on the northern side of the city near Washington Street, and on the southern side of the city on Needham Street with the Northland development. And other parts of the land are going to be developed in the near future. But I think it's important that we reach out to the residents and find out what they want. How much density do they want? And of course, how much density can the city hold? I mean, yes, it's being built near transit centers, but the MBTA is not the most reliable public transportation system in the country. So we need to think about exactly just how much density and how much housing we're going to put.
David, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, sure. I think a key part is thinking about where transit is. I mean, it's a valuable asset that we want more people to take advantage of, and it does make sense to develop in those areas. And it also makes sense to think about, how the neighborhoods feel about different development projects. I think that we need to do more to grow our housing stock, but we also need to make sure it's done in a way that it isn't just the right supply, but has the right aesthetic feel, so that people feel like the character of their neighborhoods still have the beautiful feeling that they came to Newton to have.
Brian, how would you balance that both mission-driven and aesthetic consideration to take into account citywide versus neighborhood concerns?
Sure. And, I live a block away from Washington Street. And, I think there's been some thoughtful projects there that have really added to the community. And there's been some complications as well. So, it's about recognizing that each project brings promise and complications. And we do want to make sure that that is something that every part of the city has. So, in the areas around Green Line stops, we should be having this conversation as well. And we should be laser focused on managing things like school population and traffic. And we should have the resources to do that, because all of these projects are projected to be revenue positive.
This really brings us right into zoning redesign, which kind of sprung on the community, it seems to me, in a somewhat abrupt way, but then I get my news from the local paper rather than from the city council. So I wonder what you all think of the current push to allow multi-unit homes by right in proximity to public transit, which I gather really includes about 70% of the city. Brian, let's start with you.
Sure. So, my approach would be a targeted zoning design that goes through the map very carefully and has some very specific goals in mind. How do we reduce teardowns and McMansions? How do we create more middle income housing and starter homes? How do we have more condos and apartments in our village centers? And how do we make it easier to create an accessory apartment? Those are my goals for zoning reform.
Tariq?
Yeah, when it comes to allowing multifamily housing by right all over the city, all that's going to do is create more expensive housing, which is not one of the goals for zoning redesign. I would like to see zoning redesign in village centers where you will get the much needed affordable housing units. because that is for the people who need the housing the most. It's the families who do not earn a lot of money. That should be one of the goals of zoning redesign, and not go anywhere near the multifamily housing by rights. Because again, that's just going to lead to more expensive housing.
David, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I believe in a targeted approach that takes into consideration transit, the character of the neighborhoods, and where there's an opportunity to increase density.
Well, my understanding is the vote on the proposals for new zoning has been postponed until after the November election. But I wonder, if you are elected, would you support a comprehensive rewrite of the zoning code or a revision of the existing code? Tariq, want to start?
I would say we would do a revision of the existing code. What we're currently doing is basically a page one rewrite of our zoning code, and I don't believe that's necessary. We should have a revision of our code that reduces tear downs, and it protects the affordable homes that are in our residential districts.
David?
Yeah, I think our zoning code is way out of date, and I think we can do a comprehensive overhaul while taking into account a lot of considerations. This zoning redesign process has been going on for over a decade, and I think we need to make moves on it now. And I think there's a way to do it also that streamlines the process. So when people are requesting a special permit, it doesn't take months of examination and assessment, because that adds cost to development, that adds cost to housing, that ultimately makes Newton even less affordable.
You raise the issue of affordability. I'd like to hear from each of you what you consider affordable housing in Newton, both rental and purchase of home, and what do you consider the income level necessary to afford that housing. But first, what is affordable in dollar terms? Brian.
Yeah, so affordability is based on the area median income as defined by the state. And the area is all of Greater Boston, not just Newton. And so we need what's called deeply affordable housing for people who are making less than even 50% of the area median income, or extremely low income housing for people making less than 30. But we also need what's just called affordable housing, which is people making 50 to 80% of the area median income. And we also need workforce housing, which we've created a special classification for Newton that requires housing for people making less than 110% of the area median income. Because these are all people who have trouble finding a place to live in Newton, and we need to have homes for all of them.
Tariq?
Yeah, the issue of housing affordability is personal to me. I was only able to move to Newton because I was able to find an apartment that was affordable for me to rent. So this is personal to me. But as far as housing affordability, what should the income be? Again, as Mr. Barris said, he's right on this one. It is the AMI level. We need to build more affordable housing units for the people who are at the lower end of the AMI table, the people who are beneath the 80% AMI, because those are the ones who need housing the most.
And David?
Yeah,
Your definitions, please.
I mean, the definition is the definition. You know, it's AMI. It's just a matter of what percentage we're taking into account. I think it makes sense to have opportunities for people across the range. I think honestly, if we're talking about deeply affordable housing, it's very hard to find the funding for that. I think we can't rely on Newton to solve this problem on its own. I think we need to look to the state. I think we need to look to the federal government. This is a much broader generational issue that's been going on since Reagan cut HUD funds in the 80s. And I think for Newton to solve that on its own is probably unrealistic.
So what would you guys do to limit the loss of so-called naturally affordable housing caused by luxury development, including those with 15 to 20% affordable units under inclusionary zoning? Yes, right. David.
What would we do to limit the loss of naturally affordable housing? Is that what you asked?
The loss of what they call naturally affordable housing. In other words, existing housing that is affordable and gets taken down and, gets into this vortex of higher prices.
Yeah. So to me, I believe in the laws of supply and demand. And I think the research shows that when you build more housing, the housing in that area becomes more affordable. And there has been an artificial cap on supply for decades, and allowing the housing stock to increase will actually lead to more affordable housing in the surrounding neighborhood, which I think is part of the solution.
Because of time constraints, I mean, we could be talking about this for hours. One question on,
Marjorie,
yes.
if I could just make a quick point about that.
Absolutely.
Because, I think naturally affordable housing is a misnomer, and I don't think luxury development has anything to do with it. Housing prices are going up and up and up across the board. Newton's already not affordable for far too many people. So we need to correct that.
Okay, Tariq?
I live in what we would like to call natural affordable housing. And we had a chance to help the people who live in natural affordable housing. I'm thinking about the people who lived in the Orr block on Washington Street, and they were displaced when when the trio was built. So, we got rid of natural affordable housing and built affordable housing in its place. And the problem is, I feel bad for the families that were displaced in the process. They are no longer living in Newton, and that is a problem.
I wonder what you think of whether and to what extent the city should regulate tear downs. Brian?
Yeah, I think what we really need to get to is, like I said, again, a targeted zoning reform approach that thinks about what are the things that we can do to make it less attractive to do a tear down. It makes it more attractive to build middle income housing that people can still afford, to build smaller homes on smaller plots, to build those starter homes that we know we're missing, and to protect the ones that already exist.
David, did you want to weigh in on tear down regulation? You're muted.
I think Chris Pitts might need to unmute him.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, I mean, I think that, tear downs should be done in a thoughtful way where there's some beautiful historic homes that make Newton the city it is, and we should, think about ways to preserve those. But there's also opportunity to upgrade existing homes that are falling apart, that aren't energy efficient. And a tear down isn't always a bad thing, but, we should do it with a mind to keeping the neighborhoods beautiful.
Some older people have all of their equity tied up in their homes. So does the creation of regulation of what can be done with that affect their property and therefore their retirement livelihood or their retirement living style? I mean,
Yes,
what is the homeowner's equity consideration in regulating tear downs? The homeowner who is selling.
Yeah. Well, I think that Newton home values are, only going to continue to go up. It's a desirable place for many reasons. The land itself is valuable. The potential for building new houses is valuable. So when I think about housing issues, I think about it for the people that are living here and the people that want to move here. And I think that people that own equity in their homes and it's their retirement, I think that value is going to be preserved just given the natural demand there is for a place like Newton.
Marjorie?
Yeah.
Can I give you a perfect example of what I'm thinking about here?
Sure.
So, I have a friend in Newtonville who has a small home on a large lot. And because of the current zoning code, which changed from how her neighbors' houses were developed, the back lot can't be developed right now into a new home. And so the incentive for her is to sell to a developer who's going to tear down her home and build a really large home on that property instead of being able to build a small home on the back lot. So that's the kind of thing where I think a targeted approach could help us build more starter homes.
Okay, I want to leap ahead to the budget and finance area. Newton has not fully funded its pension and healthcare benefits owed to city employees, and in fact has in excess of $1 billion in unfunded liability. How are we going to pay for this? And to what extent will you be supporting a Prop 2.5 override? I mean, we're not in great shape financially. Tariq, you want to start with that?
Yeah, the OPEB obligation. My mother is a union nurse. My father is a retired postal worker and a former member of the APWU. and people made commitments to them for their pensions and their retirements. And Newton is going to do the same. We are going to honor those commitments. But the best way to fund this is more commercial development. That is a proven fiscal positive for this city. And we also need to stop wasting money, like for example, on the $500,000 we spent on the consultant for the Washington Street Vision Plan. In my opinion, that was a bad investment for our money.
Brian, you want to weigh in on the unfunded pension liability?
Yeah, I think it's an important issue. And I think Mayor Fuller has us on a path to addressing it. That is a sound financial plan. I work on budgeting in the state legislature, and so I have some experience with this. I'm looking forward to engaging in that conversation. I also support more commercial development, but I gotta say, I'm the only person here who has actually advocated for projects that would bring more commercial development, unlike my opponent.
David?
Yeah, I think it's a tremendous problem that actually is understated in terms of how big of a problem it is. Our amount we owe is based on a generous return assumptions that we may or may not hit. And relative to our benchmark communities, we're doing much worse. So I don't think we have a great plan right now, because the plan right now will put the budget under severe pressure. $40 million was supposed to be paid off in 2019. That's going to go up to $60 million by 2025. It will be an increasingly big part of our budget over the coming years. And the only way to address it is to grow our tax revenue and to think about just responsible fiscal policy broader than that one issue.
Okay, none of you, however, answered the part of the question about whether you would support a Prop 2.5 override. Tariq, I saw your hand up, so I know you want to respond to that.
When it comes to commercial development, we need to protect the commercial development that is here right now. Like, for example, if you look at Dunstan East, which was formerly zoned commercial, it's now going to be housing, and the city is going to lose money from that development, and we're going to lose the commercial. But as in regards to, you said an override, Prop 2.5, I believe overrides would be appropriate if it's to fund a certain project, like a new senior center, a new school, a park like Gaff Pool, for example. I believe overrides would be appropriate for those projects.
So are you saying therefore a capital investment override as opposed to an operating budget override?
A debt exclusion override.
Oh, okay. Brian, you want to take that on?
Sure, yeah. I think a Prop 2.5 override may be necessary in the near future to address things, yes, like school buildings and Gaff Pool, but I also think we need to consider some of our operating pieces. I do think we need to improve our roads. I think we need to think about things like the arts and vibrant village centers. But I also think in this moment during COVID, when so many people are struggling, this is not the right time quite yet to have that conversation.
David?
Yeah, I'm definitely not ready for an override. I think it's a last resort. You don't know if an override is even going to pass. In 2013, it did. In 2008, it didn't. We have a growing age demographic of Newton citizens that are increasingly relying on a fixed income to just live their lives. So I don't think we have any reason to think that an override would pass in this environment. And we need a plan for not having an override and what we would do in the event of not having one.
Great. On a totally different subject, and I'm kind of leaping around now, the state has just passed a police reform package, and Newton has passed its own version. Could you tell me, please, to what degree do you support a defund the police approach for Newton? Let's start with you, Brian.
So I believe in a police reform approach. I support the creation of the police reform task force that the mayor has created. And I think we have to acknowledge that systemic racism is real. And it happens in our community, just like every other community. I've heard the stories from our residents, and I know how much work there is to do. I want to acknowledge that pain and say that it's police reform, it's more diverse hiring, it's pushing back against incidents of hate or bias. There's so much work to do, and I'm excited to do it on the city council.
Tariq?
Yeah, Representative Jim Clyburn of South Carolina, who was a longtime civil rights activist and a leading Black voice in America right now, does not want to defund the police, would rather reform the police. I agree with that approach, and I would like to work with the police task force when it comes to implementing reforms in Newton. But I'd just like to point out that Mr. Barish was a guest speaker at a Defund Newton police rally at City Hall this summer.
David, all right, well, we'll go to David and then back to Brian for rebuttal.
Sure. I'm against any notion to defund the police. I'm very grateful for their work. I think they have done incredible service, making Newton one of the safest cities in the country for many, many years, especially right now with the rise of white nationalism and anti-Semitism. They're protecting our schools, our churches, our synagogues. We definitely need to partner with them to ensure they have the support they need. Their facilities are falling apart. That's one area we can address. And we can also make sure they have the staff and personnel to deal with a range of situations and ensure that all citizens receive equal treatment at their hands.
Brian?
Yeah, I want to be really clear. I did speak at an affordable housing event at City Hall, where I joined young people in calling for more affordable housing in our community and to push back against a history of racial discrimination in housing. That's why I was there. And anytime someone asked me to come speak about the importance of affordable housing, that's where I'm going to be.
I understand that morale in the Newton Police Department is very low. And I think it was David who said something about the condition of police headquarters. And I've also heard it described in terms of a warrior, the need to transform from a warrior mindset to a guardian mindset. Are there things that we're asking the police to do that's not an appropriate use of their time and talent?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Tariq?
Okay, yeah, can you just repeat the question, please? Sorry.
I have to remember what I said. Are we asking the police to do things that others could be doing and not using their time and talents in a more focused way?
Yes, I think we are asking a lot of our police. We can look at the leaf blower ordinance and the snow shoveling on the sidewalks ordinance. Other departments in City Hall can do things like that.
Do you think that Newton police should wear body cams and, operate them all the time? Are there any lessons to be learned from the shooting in Newton Highlands? Brian, you're shaking your head.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with Tariq that there are things like leaf blowers that are not within their core mission, but it's also about dealing with social issues, right? Responding to homelessness, responding to a mental health crisis. They're asked to do so much. And I want to see what 21st century tools that we can use to empower our social services response so that we do have mental health and substance use professionals that are integrated into our emergency response system.
David, did we get you on this one?
No, I can answer. Yeah, I definitely agree. Police don't need to be responding to leaf blower ordinances. And also I think that having a staff that has expertise in mental health issues is a great way to supplement their work.
Tariq, you have a...
Yeah, I didn't have a chance to answer this particular
sorry.
Body cameras. The answer is yes. Body cameras would help promote transparency and communication within the police department. And as it relates to mental health services, my mother has been a psychiatric nurse for the past 30 years. And if she were standing here right now, she would say mental health services are severely underfunded at the federal, state, and local levels.
Okay, but we've got a lot of questions about governance and green space and infrastructure, and we can go back to those, but just for a break in the format, I would like to offer you the opportunity to ask a question of one or both of your opponents. And why don't we start with you, David? Do you want to pose a question to Brian, to Tariq, or to both of them?
To both of them. My question is, this is my first time getting involved in Newton politics. And one of the, I guess, upsetting things is just how much the city seems to be divided in these two ideological camps. And to sort of get past that for just a moment, I'd ask each of you to talk about the other candidates in the race in terms of what positive things they would bring to the table as a city councilor.
Brian, would you like to answer that first?
Sure. Yeah, I think we have two other candidates in this race who care deeply about our community. I am excited that David is stepping up, and I can't wait to see what he decides to do going forward. And I think Tariq has made some excellent points, has made me a better debater, certainly, and look forward to working with him on some of our shared interest in affordable housing and lowering our residential preference to allow more residents of color to move in here in whatever roles both of us are serving in going forward.
Tariq?
Yeah, if I could just say something about Mr. Barish, I certainly appreciate his support on helping make Newton a welcoming city, and his declaration to making racism a public health crisis.
Okay, Brian, do you want to pose a question to one or both of your opponents?
Sure, I'll pose my question to both, which is, you know, I have actively advocated for over 400 units of affordable housing that have now been successfully permitted in Newton. And I want to just be really specific. How many units of housing in Newton have you successfully advocated for?
Tariq?
Oh, let's see. I like the, I don't know how many housing units it is off the top of my head, but the Riverdale development in Nonantum, I think that is a fine project. I think it's about maybe 40 or 50 affordable housing units. And I serve on the Newtonville Historic District Commission. We create housing. We helped create a multifamily housing unit. And we are working on other smaller projects on a smaller scale.
David?
Yeah, this is my first time getting involved in Newton politics. So the answer is I haven't done any work to date on affordable housing in Newton. The reason why I'm running is to represent residents of Newton as a lifelong resident of Newton, as someone that has parents and kids in Newton. I'm running to advocate for the interests of people that live here.
Okay, Tariq, I think you haven't yet asked questions of your opponent or opponents.
Yeah, questions for Mr. Barish. You have repeatedly talked about the importance of racial justice in a city that has not had a Black city councilor in 34 years. So can you tell me, as a Black man who grew up in low-income housing, has experienced racism, and has been endorsed by many Black leaders in Newton, such as civil rights leader Huey Jones, how can you say to me that you will be a better voice for racial justice?
Well, you know, representation is incredibly important. And that is one of the reasons that I went out to work for Barack Obama in the first political role I ever served in. But it was also because he shared my values and had the right policies and was the right person to implement them. And you know what I've been talking about in this campaign is the commitment that I've made to racial justice, to fighting for that welcoming city ordinance that you mentioned, to advocating for Newton to declare racism a public health emergency. And I'm hoping to do this good work going forward around police reform and getting more diversity in our city staff and pushing back against incidents of hate or bias, which I have years of experience doing on the Human Rights Commission.
Okay, David?
Was he asking me that too?
If you want,
If you want to answer the question about racial justice, David, you are.
Yeah, I've answered this question in another debate. I think there's a lot of issues in this debate. On this one question, I think honestly, I wouldn't be the best candidate. I think having a diverse representation on our councilor, you know, on our city council, Tariq would obviously serve that interest better. You know, there's things I would do to move forward on being a more racially diverse city, but I'm not the best candidate on that one issue.
all right. Chris, do you, before I continue with the questions that I have here, do you want to ask any questions that the audience had submitted to you in advance, or I can just continue?
Well, we did get quite a few questions. Let me just try to cherry pick a few here. Here's one. Do you believe a new or revised zoning code will produce greater economic and racial diversity? If so, how and why?
Let's start with David.
You know, I think a new zoning code would definitely increase economic diversity. I don't think it increases racial diversity automatically. I think there's a lot we need to do to actually make people feel like they even want to move to Newton. People don't just move to a place because of an affordable house opens up. They move to a place because they know people, because they have relationships. So I think it starts with building relationships with other communities around the greater Boston area at the city level, at the community organization level, so that people know people and want to move here for that reason.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Sure. Yeah, if we do it right, it'll be targeted and it'll incrementally move us in the right direction on these issues. But I also think that David is right. Just because we have more affordable housing doesn't necessarily mean that more people of color are going to choose to live in Newton. So we need to address some of the root causes of why we have remained such a white city. And, you know, some of the intolerance that exists in our community, some of the issues that we've run into both in the schools and in our general populace. And so addressing those and becoming a more anti-racist city is key to having more people move in of color.
Tariq, I'm coming to you. In a previous debate or in some of the printed material, you had spoken of a racial reckoning due in Newton. What does that look like?
Well, it means lowering the local preference rule for affordable housing. It's currently at 70%, and I know the city is going to take this up in the near future, but I think it would be an honor if I would have a chance to vote on that
Can you explain that to the audience?
Oh, sorry about that. The local preference rule for affordable housing, there is a 70% local preference rule where if you have ties to Newton, if you live or work in Newton, or have kids in the schools in Newton, you would be have a preference of the affordable housing options. And I think it would be, as I said, it would be an honor if I have a chance to vote on that legislation. But getting back to the original question of economic and racial diversity, if we eliminate single family zoning by allowing multifamily housing by right all over the city, it will not bring racial diversity to Newton. The average net worth of a Black family in the greater Boston area is $8, and it's $0 if it's a Dominican family. So it will not bring racial diversity to Newton. It will just create more expensive housing that is unattainable to most residents and families in Massachusetts.
Chris, do you have another one that you want to throw in, or can I pose a question on the environment?
Well, I've got plenty, so.
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, okay. Do you support Newton's current restrictions on building height? And if not, how high do you think developers should be allowed to build by right or with a special permit? So how high is too high?
Tariq, you want to go with that?
I think the city council is going to tackle that question as it relates to zoning redesign in commercial districts. But, you know, when I served on the Newtonville Area Council, we surveyed the residents who lived near Washington Street, and a majority said, you know, 4 stories.
Brian, did you weigh in on building height?
Yeah, you know, I think that 4 stories by right is does make some sense. But, you know, one of the hard things for me to understand here is that my opponent has opposed projects that are at that height. And so I think we've got to be really clear about what we've been for in the past. I've been for 4-story buildings, and I do think special permit is appropriate if you're going higher than that.
David?
Yeah, I think in many areas, 4 stories makes sense. I don't think there's a magical number. It depends on the project and the location.
You know, one of you mentioned the whole notion of special permit, and right now, those special permit determinations are, in other words, those things that cannot automatically be built by right. Those are covered by city council action. Is that the appropriate place for deliberating special permit resolutions? Tariq.
Yeah, I like the special permit process, because with the special permit process, you ultimately get a better development. You get feedback from different boards and commissions within Newton. You get feedback from abutters and the surrounding neighborhood, and you also get feedback from proponents and opponents of a certain project. So I think a special permit process is a good process.
Brian?
You know, I think this has to be a much more fine-tuned conversation, because I don't think we should be using the special permit for people who are adding a mud house or an extension. I've talked to so many residents who are so frustrated by the way our city council process works. And so having a special permit for larger, more complex projects makes sense, but having a regular resident for changes to their existing home have to go through the same kind of a process as someone who's building a 200-unit development makes no sense.
David?
Yeah, it's a cumbersome process, the special permit process, and it should definitely be segmented towards depending on the complexity and impact of a project, but there should be a more streamlined way to do smaller projects. And can I just also make a request that I know we're talking a lot about zoning development and it's really important, but I think the schools, even though the city council has limited power over that, should be something that we discuss. That is a huge issue right now that the whole city is struggling with, and I'd like some time spent on that.
You can go to that in your close, because the mandate to me is deal with the specifically city council, even though I know where you are. But let me ask you a question.
And we definitely have to get to the environment too. I just need to say that.
That's what I was just about to go to. The city council passed a climate action plan in 2019. I'm wondering to what extent you are satisfied with A, the plan, and B, its implementation. And where are we as a municipality in dealing with climate change? Tariq, you want to start?
Yeah, the climate action plan passed by the city council in 2019 is a wonderful plan. Climate change is a threat to all human life, but it's more of a threat to some than others. Black and brown people suffer more from the effects of climate change. And I will be a leader on this issue by listening to experts such as Councilor Emily Norton, who has endorsed me, and Newton's own Energy Commission. Newton is a leader on green policies, but we must do more. We must eliminate fossil fuels from our transportation and our heating and help residents and small businesses transition to EVs and heat pumps instead of oil and gas. Oh,
Brian?
we also must,
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Oh.
Brian, sorry, Tariq, we'll get back.
So this is one of the top priorities in my campaign, and I've been leading on this issue for years and years, and that's why I've earned the endorsement of the Sunrise Movement and 350 Mass, because they know that I'm the right person to lead us forward on the environment. I helped advocate and get that climate action plan passed. It's a good plan, and now we need to do the hard work to implement it, and hopefully to get there ahead of time, because communities like Newton need to lead the way, like we did with Newton Power Choice, and like we can do again by making our cities more walkable and bikeable, by having net zero buildings, and so much more. I have the expertise to get this done.
David?
Yeah, I think the plan's a good one and support it, and think that Newton needs to be a leader in the space to be a role model to other cities. And at the same time, I think we all need to recognize that this is a global problem that Newton's not going to solve on its own. At the end of the day, we're going to need a federal carbon tax to really move the needle on this. And I think we should advocate that in parallel to our own local work.
All right, now the city council is considering requiring all electric heating and cooling in new construction or major renovations. Would you support that? And if so, why? Tariq?
Yes, I would support something like that. This, again, it would be good to get us off of fossil fuels and onto clean energy. Speaking about energy, Newton just hired a Newton energy coach to work with residents on issues just like that. And it's going to be an exciting opportunity to get to work with this new position as an elected leader in this community.
Let's see, did I get all three of you on that?
No.
We didn't get to answer that question yet.
Oh, okay, go ahead. Brian.
So I absolutely support net zero buildings, and I've done this work. I helped write the Spark Act with Brookline Rep. Tommy Vitolo, which would transition our buildings to being net zero buildings for new construction, and provide training opportunities to make sure people are able to do that work. So I have expertise in this area that I can't wait to bring to the Newton City Council.
David?
Yeah, I think it makes sense to have buildings that are energy efficient and support those types of ordinances.
Now, would that also include banning future natural gas hookups in the city? Who wants to weigh in on that? Let's have you all weigh in on it quickly, though. Tariq?
Yes, again, we have to get off of fossil fuels. oil and gas, and I'm also very concerned about the gas leaks that are popping up all over Newton. Just in a few years ago in the Merrimack Valley, a young man was killed when when a gas line exploded and a chimney fell on his car. So yes, this is very serious and we have to get off of oil and gas.
David?
Yeah, I think it's part of our plan is to get off oil and gas. And I think we need to be conscious of that.
Brian?
Yeah, I agree, but I do want to note, Brookline tried to do this through a home rule petition and the Attorney General said that they couldn't. So I do think we need to pursue this, but that's why it's so important to pursue net zero buildings, because that's another way to get at the same goal.
Oh, okay, and before we go to closing statements, what are your top infrastructure priorities? And do you think Newton's doing an adequate job maintaining our sidewalks, streets, buildings, and parks? And if not, what would you do differently? And I know you're not running for mayor, but what could you do to help us out with our potholes as a city councilor? Brian.
Sure. I think there's a lot more work to be done. I think we're finally getting back on some overdue maintenance around our roads and sidewalks, but I want to make our dollars go further by bringing best practices from other communities, because I know that other communities make their dollars go further. We need to fix up our fields. I hear this from everybody. Our parks, our fields, our school buildings are in bad shape in a lot of places. I think this is critical infrastructure that we need to get on, because a city like Newton deserves to have top-rate infrastructure.
David?
Yeah, I think that's just the basic services that a city should provide is good streets, good fields. And this is a priority. When you talk about all the other priorities, I think that we have to do those things first before we talk about saving the world.
So that's an interesting sideways. Tariq, can we save the world as well as saving our streets?
Well, we got to take care of our own house first before we can save the world. But as it relates to infrastructure in Newton, I think we need to look at some of our municipal buildings and land. I'm thinking particularly Gaff Pool. That's Newton's only outdoor swimming pool. It's in bad shape, and that needs to be badly updated. And we also, of course, we got to fix and update our schools. The buildings, they're not the best.
This may seem like we're getting a little bit too granular on the environment, but would you favor some sort of ordinance to protect our existing tree canopy? And what would you include? I mean, this is Newton, the Garden City, after all. Brian?
Sure. Yeah, I do think it makes sense to have some protections for our existing tree canopy.
What would that look like? I mean, that's sort of like a motherhood kind of thing. We're all for motherhood, we're all for trees, but how would you actually do it?
Yeah, so one of the key things that I've focused in on is the fact that far too often we remove a street tree and we don't replace it. And I think we need to have a much more thought out way that we deal with our roadways. And when I say that, I mean the roads, the sidewalks, the trees, the entire piece of the land that the city owns. And so I think one key strategy is making sure that the city is keeping our streets green.
Tariq?
Yes, we need to strengthen our tree ordinance, definitely. And we need to invest and plant the trees in areas of the city that have more asphalt and more concrete. So that way we can reduce heat islands. And also every time we tear down a house, the trees come down with it. So we need to protect the trees in residential neighborhoods as well.
David?
Yeah, we should make it difficult to cut down trees in development projects and elsewhere. Anytime trees go down, we should find ways to supplement our tree supply with other trees in other parts of the city.
Chris, we may have time for one quick question and short answers before we go to the close. Do you have a quickie?
Let me see here. One that hasn't been covered. Well, here's one. Would you have joined with those city councilors who sent a letter to the mayor on reopening public schools?
There, guys, you got the schools in.
Yeah. Can I just take it first, Margie?
Sure, David.
Yeah, I definitely would. And I think that it's an unusual step, but I think it's important to put public pressure and accountability on this type of situation. And we failed our students, our teachers, our parents in the way that we didn't plan and didn't invest in the school reopening over the summer. And we're getting on a better track now, but I think there's still things the city council can do. Most notably, the city council can hold regular hearings to get updates from the commissioner of HHS to make sure that the work in progress that is being promised is actually happening. And that is the most important thing over the next 8 months, is to make sure that the schools fully reopen for all students.
Okay, and Brian?
Yes, I agree completely. We need to get the schools open as soon as possible, as much as possible. And I've been advocating for months to put the right public safety measures in place so that we can do that. And now we're almost there. We've upgraded our ventilation systems. We're getting surveillance testing in place. And now we got to get the kids back in the classroom.
Tariq?
Yes, I would have signed that letter, definitely. Newton is a leader in education. Families move to Newton for the schools. They move to communities like Newton for the schools. That was true with my family. We moved from Boston to Brookline for the schools. So I understand and sympathize why so many parents are upset and have been angry with the current status of the schools that year. And as a youth soccer referee and basketball referee, I see time and time again that children learn better when they are interacting with their peers.
Very good. We now go to your closing statements, and let's start with David.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Really enjoyed the conversation. I'm running for the first time. It's my first time getting involved in local politics. I'm running a different sort of campaign, not really seeking out endorsements. I'm not raising any money. Instead, I'm asking people to direct their support to the Center Street Food Pantry, which is doing great work. And I just say that if this resonates with you, this approach of an independent campaign from a resident just trying to make their city better, spread the word, because that's the best way this campaign has a chance. We're gaining traction. It's a real campaign. If you want to be in touch, reach out to me at mickleyfornewton@gmail.com. Whether you're into my ideas or against them, I would love to hear from you. Thanks.
Brian?
Sure. My wife Claudia and I moved here almost 10 years ago to build a life together. We have our first child on the way. These issues are personal to me. I'm asking you to place your trust in me, whether it's maintaining the roads and getting our schools open as soon as possible, or making good on the promises of environmental sustainability, affordable housing, and racial justice. My name is Brian Barish, and I'm asking for your vote on March 16th or by mail, because you can trust my experience, values, and leadership. My website is brianbarish.com. Thank you, Marjorie, for your excellent moderation, and to all of you for coming to listen to us today.
Thanks, Brian. And Tariq?
Yes, thank you, Marjorie, and thank you to Mr. Mickley and Mr. Barish for participating in today's forum, and the area councils for hosting this forum. I am the candidate in this race who has a track record of supporting local representation and reaching out to you, the residents of Newton. Again, when it comes to zoning redesign, I do not support the radical changes to our zoning code that will turn Newton into an exclusive community and raise the tax burden on seniors living on fixed incomes. And when it comes to the special interests, you, the residents of Newton, will always be my special interests. Over 95% of my campaign contributions come from you, the residents of Newton. I'm here for you, and I got your back. I'm Tariq Lucas. I ask for your vote on March 16th. Thank you.
Thanks to all of you, really, not just for participating in this, but for being willing to put yourselves in front of the public and run for office. And we value that participation as a very high level of public service. We're now going to move on to the next race. Would our technical guru, Chris Pitts, please unmute the candidates for the race for Ward 1 Councilor-at-Large. The two candidates for that Ward 1 seat are John Oliver and Madeline Rinaldi. Again, these cameo introductions have been provided by the candidates themselves. John Oliver moved to Newton in 2003 and met his wife Melissa here. Their son Griffin is now a 9th grader at Newton North. John is a PTO leader, a youth sports coach, board member of Newton Community Ed, and volunteer at the Newton Food Pantry. He is a consultant focusing on designing solutions for complex challenges. He says he will use his professional experience to help balance the Newton we want with the Newton we already have. Madeline Rinaldi is an advocate, Newton Public Schools graduate, and lifelong resident of the city. She has served as the political director of March for Our Lives, Massachusetts, working on state-level legislative initiatives to combat gun violence in the Bay State. She's also worked in the Boston office of Senator Ed Markey, in Iowa for Elizabeth Warren's presidential campaign, and most recently at the Department of Energy in the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. So let's start with the first question that I asked in the Ward 2 race, starting with John. John, you said in your bio that as a consultant, you focus on designing solutions for complex challenges. How exactly would your professional and your Newton activities translate into being an effective representative for the people of Newton? In other words, how do you operationalize that whole notion of designing solutions for complex challenges? And could you be as specific as possible and give examples of areas that would apply?
Certainly. So I'll do my best to get through as much detail as I can here in 45 seconds. But really what I'm talking about is applying something called human-centered design to complex challenges. And what that really means is you're breaking down problems into individual components so that you can more easily find solutions to each of the components. A good example of this is when I worked with the city when they were going to build the new senior center in the middle of Albemarle Field. They got to redefining the senior center programs spot on, but building the facility in the middle of the park wasn't a great solution. So working with those groups, I'd be able to tease those apart so that we're finding the solutions that work for every component of the total challenge.
Great. Madeline, and by the way, do you prefer Madeline or Maddie?
Either's fine. You can call me Maddie.
Okay, Maddie. Let me ask you this. You've been a social activist, especially on the gun issue, and you've been a political activist. Could you explain how that would bear on your being able to be an effective member of Newton's legislative body?
Absolutely. So in my work as political director of March for Our Lives, Massachusetts, I worked up close and personal with the legislative process. You know, in the nitty gritty, learning what it's like to build a coalition around a bill or a specific initiative, whether it was our ERPO, our red flag laws here in Massachusetts, or crime gun data analysis, and to really build that coalition and shepherd that through the legislative process to, passage and to signature. I've also advocated, for climate issues, youth advocacy, and racial justice here in Newton, which are all, issues at the center of our political discussion. And I think that understanding, as a young leader and someone who is a seasoned political advocate and knows how those levers of government work is really going to help in allowing us to address the issues of our time and to move with the urgency that I think that this moment requires.
I would also ask you that question about if you could only change one city policy in your career, what would that be and why? John?
One policy in this city, I think that I would really take a long, hard look at. It's something I've been hearing a lot about as I've been going through this process of this campaign. And that is, I would like to see Newton rethink how we approach funding efforts that support our seniors. More of the conversations I've had recently have highlighted the fact that we have a growing population of seniors in this city, but the budget that is attached to facilities or programs and services that focus on seniors hasn't been growing in the same way. And that's the one thing I would certainly like to address first off.
Maddie?
Sure. So very first, I think something that I'm looking forward to shepherding through is virtual public comment, continuing it after the pandemic. I think, one of the silver linings of this entire thing is that we see such an uptick in engagement, especially among young residents, students, working parents who have kids and can't make it to City Hall at 7 o'clock on a weeknight, who are able to engage in conversations, whether it's about zoning redesign or, public facilities, listen to what's going on, give their input. And I think, opening the door to that democratic process for as much of our city as we can is important. And we should continue that for long after this pandemic ends and we can finally be in the same room as each other.
John, I saw in a previous debate elsewhere, when you were talking about senior issues, you said that you were stunned by how divisive was the proposal to move the senior center. And what surprised you about it? And how, and I would invite Maddie in on this too. How do you deal with the divisions that can arise around not just senior centers, but virtually everything that is related to planning and development and zoning design?
Sure, that's a big one. So I think what's really important here, and we heard a little bit about this in the, in the Ward 2 or from the Ward 2 candidates. But what I think is critical are a few things. The first of which, and I mentioned this earlier, the problem that we created here in the city for ourselves was recommending a bad solution, i.e. the location of the new senior center, as part of the overall package, right? We took about a year and a half, maybe it was even 2 years, defining what programs and services and what the building should contain or what the envelope of that building would be. And we got that right. But then when it came to where do we put it, we just completely ignored what it was that got us to that point. The COA team that was leading the effort did a great job of outlining all of their own criteria for success, but it should have never been considered to put on a park, because that was not the type of solution that was going to work, period.
Maddie, a lot of your activities have been really mission driven, and one can feel your passion. How do you mediate those divisions when your passion doesn't coincide with someone else's passion?
Sure. So what I think it's really about is, fostering community engagement and discussion to get people to buy into those initial goals before that turns into substantive steps and solutions that can often catch people by surprise if they aren't bought into that process from the beginning. I think in my work, as a legislative advocate, I've learned how you really walk that line, and you can, zero in and focus on different facets of an issue depending on who you're talking to. Because a lot of the city's issues that we talk about, whether it's development and zoning or housing and things like that, seem very abstract for everyday people. We throw around words like density and transit-oriented development, and that doesn't feel, connected to people's everyday experience. But what's really important and what I'm looking to do is to strip it down to people's everyday experiences about how it feels to get priced out of Newton and have to live in a neighboring community, not the place you grew up in, and the active steps we can take as a community to change that. And I think stripping it down to those everyday experiences is how we really make progress in a lot of these issues.
Well, you've led us very nicely into the whole area of development. And let me ask you, what can Newton do to zone for and promote more commercial development, which obviously affects tax bases and our ability to do other things? Maddie, you want to start there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what it's about is putting our, housing and our transit commitments in our village centers, being very bold about that. Because if we want, the state and the MBTA, for example, to invest in Newton as a community, we need to create the economic environment that is conducive to that investment. So it's doing things like transit-oriented development through our zoning redesign overhaul. It's doing things like investing in mixed-use development, where we're able to have, grow our commercial tax base while adding, density and affordable units to our village centers where people really need them. Being able to use all of the tools in the toolbox to build the housing and build the transportation so that that commercial tax base and revenue can grow and allow us to pay for all of the things that we need to pay for as a city.
John?
Yeah, I think I would take the approach, first off, I would be looking at rebounding from COVID. This pandemic has seen not only, even if we don't consider the dramatic impact to our health and safety, it has also shut down a lot of small businesses in and around Newton. I would like to see City Council work with our economic development team in the city to help those businesses rebound so that we can go out and attract new businesses, to leverage what we believe are our strengths here in Newton, and there are many of them. We have to refocus on populating those small businesses throughout our village centers. And I also think it's really important that we start to consider in large developments, working with developers, just like we do for affordable housing or inclusionary housing within those large developments. We should be considering a plan that does the same for retail businesses within those developments.
Maddie, you have said in talking about building housing around transit centers that we have to make sure that mass transit is upgraded. So tell me, please, what's the local role in that as opposed to the state's role, as in, for example, the T and commuter rail and T buses and so on? And in that context, you've talked about, needing to better leverage state funds. How do you, as a city councilor, bridge that, not to mention that part of the infrastructure, but bridge that divide between local desire and state power?
That's a great question. So I think it's sort of a twofold solution. The first part is sort of what I was talking about earlier of demonstrating that commitment towards building near transit, housing near transit, growing our commercial tax base near transit so that we attract that investment. So from when the state looks at a list of cities and towns saying, where should we allocate our dollars? We're at the top. But it's also about communicating with and fostering good relationships with our state delegation up on Beacon Hill, so that when budget season rolls around, we are able to give a list of priorities and say, there are things like, for example, the Newtonville commuter rail, which we know is inaccessible, very dangerous, is long overdue for investment, to say these are things we need dollars for. Here's about how much, and we would like you to make it happen. And I think fostering that constant communication and relationship to leverage those resources is something that a lot of cities and towns do proactively, but I think it's something that Newton needs to step up and do a little bit more of.
Thanks. John, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I think that there is more recently, we've seen a shift, if you will, and for example, the new legislation that came out on the housing choice just about a month ago, a little over a month ago now, where the state is actually asking or forcing now some changes in not only the types of housing that Maddie's talking about, in and around their transit hubs. I think there are 22 communities they consider to be MBTA communities. And what the state is asking cities and towns to do is to step up our commitment to supporting their transit, right? And what I think is going to be important is that we maintain the two-way dialogue that Maddie's talking about, but we also need to make sure that the transit is not only up to snuff in terms of the schedules, the services, and the quality of the equipment they're using, because if we just continue to focus on one half of that equation, we're going to be creating a much bigger problem than we already have.
Okay, we've had the big red sign, John, so I hate to cut you off, but let's take this a little further. It's unclear when or even if all of the T's COVID-inspired cuts to Newton's public transit will be restored. And even before those cuts, there were serious questions about the adequacy of public transit in Newton. Should Newton's elected and appointed officials proceed with zoning design based on transit-oriented development in the absence of any actual improvements in public transit service? And I would add to that I am told that something like 70% of the city is within a half a mile of a transit center. So, John, why don't we start with you on that? Because you got cut off, and then we'll go to Maddie.
Yeah, my fault for that. I lost track of where the red sign was. So in terms of how we coordinate these efforts, number one, I think it's really important that we take a long, hard look at what we expect the demand to be, not only for housing, but transportation and commercial opportunities on the other side of COVID. I do think right now we are getting a little bit of, we're putting the cart ahead of the horse a little bit in terms of where we're going with zoning. There are some things we should be working on with zoning right now, fixing problems that we know to exist. And I am concerned, like I just mentioned, about the fact that we need to coordinate the return, if you will, of public transportation with any development that would happen or is proposed along any transportation lines.
Maddie?
Sorry, I just saw the red light.
Sure, yeah. So, I think what this also comes down to is an equitable distribution of public transit across the city, making sure that when we think about where new housing should go, as we want to focus in on transit-oriented development, that we focus, on all of the green line stops that we have and think about how we can do this equitably. I think, you know, we don't have to pick and choose between committing to transit-oriented development and zoning redesign and advocating for more reliable funded MBTA service. I, you know, have faith in us as a city that we can do both at the same time, to use, you know, our soft power as elected leaders to communicate, you know, with our state delegation, with the MBTA, to make sure that those needs are advocated for, and also invest in the long-term process that is zoning redesign that allows us not to create this change overnight, but to build that capacity for that change, so that as we see these investments come in, we're able to build that housing that supports it.
So what can we do? One thing that the city could have done, couldn't it, would be to provide intra-city transportation. And one sees very little, if any, of that. Maddie, there's something the city really could do. What should it do?
I totally agree with you. I think, you know, transportation in and around our city is really important, because Newton is big, and, you know, being able to go north, south, and east and west is not really an option for a lot of folks right now, unless, you know, you get in a car. I think, you know, we've started sort of thinking about it in sort of a targeted way with our sort of Numo service, you know, making just ways for folks to get around easier who maybe have mobility issues. But I think going forward, whether it's through the MBTA or otherwise, we should definitely explore options to ease transportation in and around our city, not just, you know, into hubs like Cambridge and Boston, which are really important and obviously are very valuable to our transportation landscape. But I think that intracity transportation is also important, and I would, you know, be really eager to work on that and, you know, find areas for investment for that on the council.
John, can you get us across town?
I think that there are actually quite a few, or at least several options that are currently available. We have Numo, like Maddie just mentioned. The city is also investing in and supporting the green bikes, which I think are great in and around town, or is it Blue Bike now? Either way, there are bikes available for use throughout the city. There are several stations. I think we're continuing to look at how we can improve that service, not only north-south, but east-west as well. And there are currently bus lines that run through the city, right, that have multiple stops within the city. And there's also the opportunity, frankly, for us to invest more heavily in electric vehicle charging stations throughout the city, which I think is going to be a really worthwhile endeavor for us over the next few years.
Part of the whole discussion of providing more multi-unit dwellings rests with your sense of density. And I wonder how much population growth you think Newton can and should absorb over the next couple of decades. John.
Sure. I think that the question for me isn't only how much density or how much growth should we be absorbing. I think what's really important for us to pay attention to, and I've heard a few of the questions asked, and hopefully we'll get to some of that here in the next half an hour or so. But what's really important for us to figure out is Newton created a comprehensive plan. Now, that comprehensive plan basically says that Newton can accommodate 15% of growth in housing units over a specific time frame without sacrificing the city's services that we already enjoy. And I think it's critical that we continue to maintain an eyeball on that balance. To me, that's the critical part.
Maddie, your thought on increased density in Newton?
Sure. So I think this idea of like an ideal population is really subjective. It depends on what you're prioritizing and sort of where your views are. I'm in agreement with the pact that Mayor Fuller entered. And, you know, what I do know is that Newton has made a commitment. Our city has made a commitment, and we have a responsibility to address the inflating regional housing crisis that we're facing. And currently we are behind the benchmark that we need to be for providing the housing units that we need to in order to uphold our end of that bargain. And so that means we need to grow, but that doesn't mean we do so, you know, in a way that's not thoughtful or deliberate, because, you know, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about making sure that those public facilities investments come along with us, that those traffic considerations come along with us, but that we commit to that, you know, that process just generally, because we are facing a regional housing shortage. And so our approach should act like it.
John, you had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's interesting because there are two things that I just heard there that concern me. The first of which is there was a commitment made on Newton's behalf but we don't know what that commitment is. I've heard guesses. I've never seen it written down on a piece of paper. And I think that the city, residents of this city, need to know what that commitment is. And also, I just heard Maddie mention that, you know, benchmarks in the city. I think we need those benchmarks. I think we have a couple, and the one I just mentioned, right? The city's comprehensive plan says 15%. Well, we're already halfway there with the 2,000 plus units that we've already greenlighted in terms of rental units. And I'd like to see a lot more granularity in this plan, even before we go too far on zoning.
If I may.
Sure.
Sure, and I don't think anybody, you know, who's advocating for zoning redesign to enable more multifamily in Newton is saying that we want to do so without, you know, benchmarks and public, you know, input and engagement on those benchmarks. But I think what it boils down to is that commitment, commitment that we have as a city. And that's not to say we do it recklessly and we don't engage people on those benchmarks and those criteria, because I agree with you. They should be transparent. We should be open about it. We should say, here's where we are regionally and how much we need to, you know, supply in order to get there. But I think, you know, an absence of that understanding, you know, is not a reason for us to just stall the process entirely.
What's your thinking? Do we have a housing crisis in Newton, John?
I think we have an affordable housing crisis in Newton. I'm not entirely convinced that there is just a flat out housing crisis going on in Newton. I certainly think that there are places that we can grow and we should grow. We continue to need to modernize what we're doing and how we're thinking about our community. But at the end of the day, we need to focus on, in my opinion, the creation of affordable housing above all. That is the most important goal that I think we should be looking at when we consider how we should be growing.
Maddie?
So yes, we are facing a regional housing shortage as a greater Boston region, and Newton is in a housing unaffordability crisis. And that has many facets. You know, it's the difficulty for, you know, our teachers and our social workers to find a place that they can afford. It's the difficulty for folks like me who, you know, can't afford to move back here after we graduate. It's an absence of low-income housing for folks who can't even pay 50% of area median income. It has all of these facets because our shortage affects different groups of our population differently. And so what we need is a comprehensive approach that allows us to tackle those different facets at the same time with different solutions. We need to be able to do that all simultaneously.
Well, one of the most contentious aspects of this whole subject area has to do with the move to allow multi-unit homes by right in, within a certain distance of public transit. What is your feeling about allowing multi-unit homes by right, therefore not having to go to the city council? John.
Sure. So I think that the changes that our city council have been considering as part of a zoning redesign, there have been several different analyses that I have read about exactly what you're talking about, what the impact would be. And there are two things that we know we would be creating through the proposal as it was originally written up or drafted. And I do acknowledge it was a proposal, but we know that it would have increased density and it would have increased density of market rate housing. And by, as an indirect impact, it would have increased the demand on city services. I did not support those parts of the zoning redesign for those reasons.
Maddie?
Sure. So multifamily by right everywhere is not on the table. It's not being debated. That has been stated multiple times by our leaders on the city council, by our mayor. What is on the table right now and what our discussion really should be about are deliberate, targeted solutions to increase density in our village centers, near our MBTA stops. And that's the common sense place that we need to start. You know, fixating in on hypotheticals that are not the subject of negotiation in our current moment, I think aren't, you know, just counterproductive to our entire redesign process, but I think they do a massive disservice to the hard work that we have been doing to address decades of residential segregation and environmental pollution that our current zoning ordinance has contributed to. And I think we need to start from that place of acknowledging where we are and saying this is how we move forward.
Do you believe that a new or revised zoning code will produce greater economic and racial diversity? And if so, spell out how that would work exactly, Maddie?
Sure. So if we do it right, then absolutely it would. I think thinking about the way that we, incentivize the construction of smaller homes, starter homes is really important. Thinking about the way that we can build in, housing for, those folks that I mentioned earlier, below 50 or 30% of AMI. Thinking about how we can build multifamily mixed use near transit. If we do it right, we can do things like, adjusting our local preference rule, making sure that we do things to, widen the scope of socioeconomic variety here in Newton. And it's not just related to our zoning code. I think, as mentioned in the last debate, a lot of it has to be environmental too. Creating cultures of exclusion and inequity are not going to attract residents of color, regardless of how affordable our homes may be. So I think zoning redesign is a part of that, but I don't think it's the entire puzzle. And I think we owe it to really commit ourselves to all of those different pieces.
John?
Yeah, so I would agree that the zoning is a tool by which we can control, dictate what can be built where. It is not in and of itself going to lead to racial diversity. That is a much different issue. It's a much broader issue. We need to make, and in summary, we need to make Newton a much more welcoming city before people of color or any other group are going to feel comfortable moving here. In terms of economic development, however, that is where I think not only zoning, but our broader housing strategy that I've mentioned a couple of times needs to come into play. How much of this housing, what types of housing, where are we going to build it across the city? That's a conversation we need to be having.
Quickly, the Newton loses about, Maddie, you were talking about smaller homes that are therefore more accessible, more affordable. Newton's been losing about 100 older homes, those more affordable ones, a year. And I wonder what the two of you think about whether the city should regulate tear downs.
Would you like me to?
Let's start with you, John.
Sure, thank you. So I think tear downs, while not all tear downs are bad, for the most part, the tear downs that we're seeing throughout Newton, however, are bad. They're not only bad for our neighborhoods because we have a zoning code that is broken. It's not working for us anymore. People are building, homes that are too big, or McMansions, and they're building them too close to their property lines. They're tearing down too many trees. It's bad for our environment. We have to work out, and we have to do this quickly, in my opinion. We have got to shut down this process of not only eliminating housing that is more naturally affordable, but the process by which we're incentivizing developers to do this kind of work.
Let's move on a little bit because I think we've kind of covered a lot of the development and zoning redesign superficially, but we did cover it. And move on to budget and finance. Newton has not funded its obligations to pay the lifetime pensions and healthcare benefits owed to city employees. In fact, our outstanding debt is in excess of $1 billion. How are we going to pay for that? And that debt, by the way, amounts to about $31,000 per household. So, and at the same time, we've got new buildings, school replacements, and so on that have to be done. Maddie, let's start with you. How would you address the issue?
Sure. So I think, first just acknowledging and a mutual understanding that, we need to keep our word as a city and plan ahead for the expenses that we know we're going to have, because we made bargains to our city workers and it's our job to uphold them, not passing the problem off to my generation and generations to come to deal with. That's not to say that there won't need to be creativity, innovative thinking in terms of growing our commercial tax base, making sure that that pie of revenue continues to expand. But I think, I'm wholly prepared to take that on and to do that. I will always, as a leader, be on the lookout for ways that we can use our money responsibly and to make sure that that pie keeps growing so that we're able to, fund these unfunded liabilities, make sure that we're on a path to support residents and uphold the bargain that we said we would.
John?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really important, like Maddie just said, it's important that we make sure that we are looking at ways to continue to, grow the size of our budget, to increase the size of that pie, so to speak. And I do think that there are a lot of opportunities for us to look around our city and find ways we can right size, if you will, some of our spending. Maybe there are certain line items that we can forego for a while, but there's also one thing I want to mention. We haven't not been paying down our pension liabilities or our pension responsibilities, because we have been. I think that the mayor started doing that and has set us on a course to continue to not only pay down our pensions, but we're going to have to start getting into the bigger part of that challenge, which is the OPEB liability. And I assume that's what you're talking about.
Right. Why don't you tell the audience what OPEB stands for?
Absolutely. So there are two big components of the commitment that we have to our retirees. Number one is pension, and the second is OPEB. And that stands for basically other post-employment benefits. That's everything from, the vast majority of it is healthcare. So those two components there, I think, total somewhere in the $1.3 billion range. And that is the biggest challenge from my perspective that we face as a city. And I think there are a lot of things that we're going to have to take a look at and get incredibly creative on if we're going to meet all of those commitments in a timely fashion.
Does part of incredibly creative also imply a Prop 2.5 override? John, and then Maddie.
Well, it could, but let's be really specific here. There are different kinds of overrides. They're more operational, and then there's the debt exclusion. And I think that when we start to consider where we're going to go or how we would use the dollars that we would need as part of an override, I think it's important for us to focus on overrides that get us facilities. We need a new senior center. We need a new Gaff pool. We've got schools that are in trouble. We have fire stations and a police department, all of which are going to need funding. So yes, I think that we need to think about it, but only as a last resort. And I would like to see Newton getting much more fiscally responsible before we consider an override.
Maddie, your thoughts on an override?
Sure. So, we are in a very bumpy financial state right now. And so I think down the line, as things continue to progress, if it, crystallizes and we realize that we will need a Prop 2.5 override, then I will support it. But I want to make very clear, I'm committed to figuring out how, the effects of that override can relieve pressure that it would put on, lower income residents, working residents, and that we make sure that the different parts of that override would be responsible and they would be targeted, because we're a growing population here in Newton. We want to make sure that we maintain access to good quality services and facilities and make sure that our financial commitment keeps up with that, but we make sure we relieve pressure on seniors and lower income residents to make sure that we do it fairly and equitably.
Okay, so one of those quality services has to do with police department. And I just wonder the position of the two of you on the defund the police concept. Oh, Maddie.
Sure. So I believe in a comprehensive, evidence-based approach to public safety here in Newton, in the building of a public safety apparatus that aligns with the time that we're in. This looks like implementing recommendations of our police reform task force, which will be released in full very soon. It looks like, doing things like mandating de-escalation and duty to intervene, integration with mental health and substance abuse professionals. And, doing those changes, not out of a reflection of hatred or frustration with our city's police, but, because those are, there are people who love and serve our community, but of an understanding of broader systemic issues as a whole. And I think that's where we need to start in thinking about how we can build a public safety apparatus here in Newton that fits the need of our city now, not, 20, 30 years ago, but here right now.
John, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so when it comes to policing and defunding, or this process or concept of defunding the police, I think that that is a complete and utter non-starter as a slogan. I think it's a patently bad idea. You know, Presidents Obama and Biden agree that is just the wrong way to go. I want to work with our police department. I want to understand what it is that we can do to improve how we police and provide a safer community for everyone here in Newton. But let's not make any let's not dilly-dally around this. My opponent is a vocal defund the police activist. She was promoting a defund the police rally at Newton Police Headquarters within 10 hours of the events that took place on January the 5th.
So Maddie, do you want to answer that?
Yes, I would. Thank you so much. So, I don't support, many of the recommendations and the measures put forth by, I guess, Defund NPD as a group. It's why the word defund doesn't appear on my campaign platform, even though I am the only candidate with a comprehensive public safety platform about how we can build this public safety apparatus. But I think the expectation that, because of differences in tactics, that I should never hear the concerns or actually listen to the organizers working to advocate for racial justice and public safety here in Newton is both unrealistic and counterproductive. Again, it's why I'm the only candidate in this race who is presenting those substantive evidence-based solutions to improving public safety. And I think that's what this conversation needs to get back to and what we need to engage in as a city.
What are the lessons of the shooting in Newton Highlands? And does that argue for our police to have body cams at all times? John?
I definitely think that body cams and the ability to review footage is a critical part of any police department's accountability and their ability to be transparent. So yes, I would advocate for body cams. The at all times is a good question. I think that I would need to learn more about that particular topic for the at all times. But I definitely think that we learned quite a bit from the events on the 5th. We had a neighbor who tragically lost his life that day because he did not have access to a safety net of mental health professionals and services that could have been there for him, that could have actually outreached to him to get him the help he needed before he got into a crisis.
Maddie?
Sure. So I think, what we can take from that, I think first and foremost, it allowed us to broaden the conversations we were already having about public safety and policing here in Newton that were, that began in the spring and the summer about specifically racial justice and racial profiling in policing. But now we're sort of able to expand it and think about how we can build public safety that makes, residents with mental illness, disabled residents, LGBTQ residents feel truly safe in our city. And I think John is right. I think we've learned a great deal about the role of, adequately and accessibly funded mental health support, both to prevent, individuals from reaching that moment of crisis and to get them out of that crisis once they're in it. Because I think both of those have to be really well thought out and adequately supported if we want to prevent anything like this from happening in the future.
Thank you. John, did you want to add anything to that, or that was not a hand raised that I?
Okay. No, sorry.
Why don't we have each of you ask a question of the other, and then we'll go back to, the full panoply of my questions, and we'll go to Chris also. Maddie, why don't you start asking something that you've been dying to ask John about?
Sure. So I think I'm asking this question not just for myself, but for approximately 20,000 members of Generation Z who live here in Newton. In the near term, we're going to have to deal with the worst effects of a lot of the problems that we are inheriting from your generation, given that, the Newton City Council is already a super majority. That's over 2/3 members over the age of 50. Why do you believe it's a good thing to deny, my generation a voice in our future, to add another member of a group that is already overrepresented?
Interesting. I don't see this as a process whereby I'm denying anyone anything. The people that are watching this debate and all the voters across Newton, they're the ones who are going to be making the decision as to who they think is the best representative for them in this race. I'm not denying anyone anything in this process. I'm running because I believe I'm the best candidate for this job. I have the qualifications for this job, period. And when it comes to the other voices, the 20,000 other voices, I want to represent everyone in this city so that Newton has an opportunity to be outrageously successful.
John, do you want to ask a question? Oh, you did ask a question of Maddie.
No.
No, you did not. Fire away.
Maddie, I heard you say here in this debate that you are focused on using data and being evidence-based in your approach to solutions, which I think is fantastic. But I've also heard you say that the zoning proposals that were being discussed, and it might return back to the debate table here at the end of 2021 or perhaps in somewhere in 2022, I've also heard you say that we should continue to press forward with that conversation. But right now, the goals that have been outlined have no data in them. They're providing no evidence of how the tactics are going to lead to the solution of the goals or delivering on the goals. And I'm curious, how would you reconcile those two statements?
I guess I would say I'd reconcile them by saying that they're not opposing. I think, this journey that we're on, this ongoing, now over 10 years long process of zoning redesign is, the point of an ongoing process like this is to try things, to explore options, and then to decide maybe they're not for us. We'll put a pin in something. We'll scrap something and start over or do something else. It's this journey is not linear. And I think, being able to take steps and to press forward when we may not have all the answers about specifically, one part or another is not, detracting from that process. It's not, allowing us, to behave recklessly. It's engaging that process. That's part of that process too. And I think, there's no reason that we should be, sitting on our hands, not taking up this challenge, just because we haven't, seen the specific data on one part or another. I think what's important is that we engage wholly in this process, whether it means, trying something, deciding it's not for us, trying something else, maybe that will work, soliciting soliciting input and then acting on that input. I think it's all part of the process and we have to commit to every piece of it.
Can you both share with us how you would weigh a vote where the preponderance of opinion, especially in a particular neighborhood, was opposed to something that on a philosophical level you embraced? How do you weigh the macro versus the micro in casting your vote? Madeline?
I mean, I guess, when we think about, making a city decision, making a vote and soliciting input from constituents, we are running at large. And so we have to look at our entire body of constituents, hear from everybody about what those concerns are, make sure that we, actively seek out opposing views, make sure we hear all sides. And then our job is to make a decision with our best judgment and our views in mind. And that may diverge from something that, a constituent or group of constituents believe. They may, dislike, a decision that I've made. But what is my responsibility is to communicate honestly and transparently about not only the decision that I made, but the reasoning behind it, because everybody should be entitled to that reasoning, whether or not it aligns with mine. And I think that's what being an elected leader and an active member of our democracy is about being open and transparent and honest, even when the viewpoints diverge.
John, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's well said. I do believe that is, what we're talking about now is that's what's incumbent upon being an at-large city councilor, right? As a representative of Ward 1, there are, topics and thoughts and opinions that might exist in Ward 1 that are not shared throughout the entirety of Newton. And I think that is what's so fantastic about the way that our city council works. We have representatives that are dedicated to the ward, and we have representatives that are citywide. I think that the balance of those two is critical, and having both of those voices at the table is also critical.
Chris, do you have any audience questions that are needing to be expressed? Please.
Yeah, here's one I'm sure you'll all enjoy. Most in Newton understand that global warming is a serious threat. There's a spectrum of approaches to help people adopt green policies. These range from educational campaigns to incentives like rebates and tax breaks, to rules like plastic bag bans and penalties like fines and increased taxes. We want to know where you are on the spectrum. For example, would you vote to impose a tax on people who do not use renewable energy sources like solar panels?
Start with John.
I would be much more an advocate of leading people with a carrot as opposed to using something like, a tax or a penalty as a stick. I think that there are a lot of things that our climate action plan here in Newton have laid out. Just as an aside, I think that plan itself should be a model for how Newton outlines a lot of our plans. It's very clear. Here are the things we've got to get done. Here's how we're going to go get them done. Here are the milestones across time. Really well laid out plan. But I also think it's important for us to be able to treat these things differently, because as we know, in about 14 years from now, you're not going to be able to buy a new fossil fuel burning car in Massachusetts. That's just one example of how I would look at those things individually, because they all have a role.
Maddie?
Yeah, so I think on the different components that you mentioned, Chris, I think we have to embrace them all. I think, I agree with John in that I think, carrots are more effective than sticks, creating an environment where, people want to take that incentive because it's not only the, the morally or environmentally right thing to do, but it's more cost effective because we know that 10 or 15 years down the line, when we're going to be ripping out fossil fuel heat, it just makes sense to require that all of our new buildings, have electric heating and cooling. I think it's about investing in educational campaigns, like you mentioned, to make sure residents understand the specific steps that they can take in their own lives, but also to understand that this is systemic. This is bigger than Newton. We have to use our sort of softer power to work on the state level and make sure that we, jump at opportunities like our net zero stretch energy code for our buildings, pending the passage of the climate bill, making sure that we really leave no stone unturned because the stakes for the climate crisis are high.
Okay, John, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, and I just wanted to add in, because I think it's also really important for us to understand that one of the things that I've learned in my professional career is how to help people understand change. And that relies heavily on not only education, but getting what type of education and what types of things we're leading them to. Because it's much more important, for example, for a homeowner, like for example here, when our furnace starts to poop out, we'll be looking at replacing that and putting it on the onto the electrical grid. But forcing somebody to do that with a perfectly good and functioning piece of equipment doesn't make sense to me. I mean, these things need to be replaced as they become obsolete or start to fail. And that's what I mean by later on, perhaps we've got to go through this process, if you will, of treating each of these things differently.
Well, while we're on the subject of climate, can you address the issue of Newton's tree canopy? We're the Garden City. How are we doing in terms of preserving the greenness, which, has health implications as well as aesthetic? Maddie?
Sure. I think, an ordinance that would protect our tree canopy is well needed here in Newton. I think, the specifics of what that would look like, are still pretty much unclear, but I would hope it would ensure equitable distribution across the city. I mean, we have areas, especially here in Nonantum, where it's a lot more asphalt and concrete, and you don't see as many trees lining our roadways and our sidewalks where they would actually be, really needed. I think it needs to be a lot harder to cut down trees, especially near roadways and sidewalks, like I mentioned, because especially older trees who have been here for, a number of years and who add, so much to our community, like you said, not just in terms of aesthetics and environmental, air quality and things like that, but, they're a part of what makes Newton the Garden City. And I think we need to invest in more, green space and trees if we want to reach our goal of net zero by 2050 or ahead of time.
John, you've been involved in parks. Can you address that? And also, maybe both of you reflect on whether Newton's golf courses should be granted a permanent conservation easement in order to receive favorable real estate tax treatments and maintain the open space. I'm not a golfer, by the way, so I have no horse in this race. John?
Well, I do have a horse in that race because I am a golfer. But it's important for us to consider. I mean, we have, I believe, 4 private golf courses here in Newton, plus Newton Com. And I believe it's critical that we work with those entities, because they should be paying their fair share of taxes. I'll probably never be invited back to any of those courses to play for saying that, but I think that's important. As a city, we need to be successful. They need to be a part of that success. Paying their fair share of what their taxes are is definitely a part of that. And Maddie and I both live in a neighborhood that is seeing a significant amount of tree loss. I think it's important that we focus on making it harder to take trees down and replacing every tree that does have to be taken down with at least 1 more tree, if not 2 or more.
Maddie, golfer or no? What you're thinking?
Aside from mini golf, but I'm with John on this one. I think, appropriate taxation is where we need to start, because, they are, community institutions that, receive a lot from our community. In fact, I think a lot of members from our private golf courses don't even live in Newton. And, if we as a city want to be upholding, getting we should out of that symbiotic relationship, we need to be asking them to pay their fair share and thinking about, the natural resources that golf courses take up as vast open spaces, and how we can really, spare no expense and, making sure we invest in green space everywhere else that we possibly can.
What is your absolute top infrastructure priority? Maddie and then John.
I would say sidewalks and walkways. I think especially in COVID, as people are cooped up inside and really outside is the only place you can go. I think clearing them in the winter has proved to be sort of a difficult endeavor for us as a city. I think, and it also becomes an equity and a physical safety issue for residents with disabilities for whom it's unsafe, to go on a very icy or snowy walkway or sidewalk. For our seniors who really just, need an opportunity to get outside, I think we need to be diligent about expanding and connecting walkways in Newton, and also making sure that when we have snow or, other weather that may, damage them, there might be, things that fall on them, that we make sure that we're diligent about clearing them and that residents are able to access them.
So John, I know we have a lot of infrastructure needs, but how do you rank them, or what's your top priority?
Absolutely. And I'm going to answer, quite frankly, I think the most important resource that I would be focusing on right now in Newton is our people. We've talked a lot about, over the past hour, the divisiveness that's going on in our city, the polarization that a lot of these topics have. I really, really think we need to focus on utilizing data and transparency to center people on a starting point for all of our conversations, so that we can try and mitigate some of the polarization, no better word for it. I want to bring people back together around the topics to find the solutions that are going to work for us, because no one here is advocating that we sit on our hands and don't make progress.
Thank you. Chris, I think we have time for one more question from the audience. You had something about 40B?
Sure. Let's see. Can you explain your stance on concerning Newton and 40B safe harbor, and how that relates to affordable housing in Newton?
Let's see. John, you want to tackle that one?
Absolutely. I think that 40B is, well, there's a really important aspect of 40B that we need to start to talk about more here in Newton. Because if we're going to get serious about affordable housing, and I think and I hope we are, we need to start to consider how we're going to get to safe harbor. And if Marjorie, I'll just there might be a lot of people who don't understand that.
Please.
Safe harbor, there are three ways that we can achieve safe harbor under 40B legislation. And 40B legislation in Massachusetts is a state law. And what safe harbor really means is if you can get to 1.5% of your total land within your city boundaries being used for affordable housing, or 10% of your total housing stock or your SHI, subsidized housing inventory, I believe is what that stands for, you have the ability to claim safe harbor, which means that no developer can come into your city and recommend or go after a special permit under 40B legislation, which basically would otherwise circumvent the special permitting process. And I'm very much in favor of achieving safe harbor, because that is going to be the only way that we can get back control over the types of developments that we think are going to benefit Newton.
Maddie?
I agree. I think it's important we get to safe harbor. I think, and zooming out sort of as a broader strategy for approaching affordable housing, what we want to do as a city in terms of how we approach things like, public investment, the creation of something like an affordable housing trust fund, is ensure that there is as much, local control and oversight from our city as possible in determining what this housing looks like and where it goes. Because we want to be competitive. We want to be able to call the shots about, where it goes and what it looks like. And we don't, we want to minimize the ways that, other, whether it's the state who, has to ask these things of us, dictates what that looks like. And I think this is part of that equation. We have to look at all of the tools in the toolbox and make sure that we as a city decide for ourselves, the important, ways that we can create affordability for all of those different parts of our housing crisis that I talked about earlier in hitting those different, layers of AMI.
Great. Well, the time has come for closing remarks. Let's start with Maddie.
Sure. So thank you so much again, Margie and the area councils, for organizing and broadcasting this debate, for having both of us here today. I'm asking for your vote because I understand the gravity and the urgency of the moment that we're in. And I am committed to not just resolving the crises we face and achieving a more equitable future, but for doing it in a way, that brings more of our city along with me. I believe it's one thing to express support for an issue like affordable housing or environmental justice, but it's another to understand the nuanced complexities of that issue and to pursue bold, brave decisions when it's not necessarily the easy or convenient thing to do. Folks like to say that young people are our future, but we're not the future. We are the present. And we're ready to take the reins now. And so I humbly ask for your vote today. And if you'd like to learn more, you can go to renalifornewton.com or at Renali for Newton on social media to learn more about the campaign. Thank you all so much.
John.
Thank you. So a campaign is a lot like a job interview. So I'm asking you to hire me as your next Ward 1 City Councilor at Large, because I have the skills, the experience, and the perspective that make me the most qualified candidate for this job. I am committed to being a collaborative leader in Newton, to pursuing outrageous success for our city. I want to work with you. I want to work with your ideas. I want to listen to what is on your mind. I want to act on your behalf. I would be privileged to serve you on Newton City Council. I ask for your vote on March 16th. Thanks so much for your time and attention today.
Thank you, John. Thank you. And thanks to both of you, and obviously to the other three candidates for being with us today and for being willing to step up and participate in public service. I now want to turn the virtual podium back to our fearless leader, Chris Pitts, to wrap up the forum.
Oh, wow. Well, that was really fantastic. I thank you all for coming, of course. I want to give a special thanks for Marjorie. You did a great job. Formidable.
Love doing it.
The video is going to be available right away on the Waban Area Council Facebook. I'll put it up on YouTube as well. We'll post those links in follow-up listings. It should also be available on New TV's Vimeo channel. Just remember, everybody votes on these races. So to vote by mail, you must apply to receive your mail-in ballot by March 10th. And ballots will not automatically be sent to people who voted in mail last November, whatever. So you have to apply for it. You can drop it off at City Hall in one of the drop boxes. Early voting will be in person from March 8th to the 12th, from 8:30 to 5 p.m. at City Hall. And election day is March 16th from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. And those are going to be at your normal polling places. So with that, thank you so much to everyone for participating. I think there was more than 300 people at one point. And really congratulations to wonderful candidates, really. So
Thank you all.
thank you all. Arrivederci, au revoir, sayonara, and see you soon.